Before I start, I do want to uh, acknowledge, I think it's critically important, um, gender diversity and uh, the need to be inclusive. Um, since I am talking primarily today about sort of historical efforts um, to achieve gender equity, however, I too am going to be using the gender binary while still acknowledging its shortcomings. So as you can see, Congress passed the 19th Amendment in June 1919, and it was ratified in August 1920. Its passage was a major step in the fight for women's rights and equality among the sexes, but it fell short in numerous ways. There had been a biracial coalition that formed during abolition and which held promise as a future political force. But it was a coalition that was very tenuous and eventually fractured. Suffragists Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and a number of white allies were instrumental in organizing support for women's franchise, for the franchise, but they refused to support the 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, which removed race, but not sex, as a barrier to voting. Instead, they turned away from longtime friends and allies such as Frederick Douglass, who'd been the only male speaker at their 1848 Seneca Falls Convention and who spoke in favor of women's suffrage. Instead, white suffragists opted for what Anthony admitted was a strategy of expediency, a conscious decision to fight specifically for white women's enfranchisement. Why? Well, first, they didn't exactly embrace racial equality, and they needed the support of at least some of the Southern states. So they appealed to white Southern men and women to support women's suffrage as a way to offset, counterbalance the potential political power of Black men who had been granted voting rights, at least on paper, with the 15th Amendment. Both Anthony and Stanton died before the 19th Amendment passed, but the damage was done. The battle for women's rights excluded Black women, and white women were now seen as a bulwark against enfranchised Black men. When it did pass, the 19th Amendment really did enable most white women to vote, but the votes of non-white women and men continued to be suppressed on the basis of race. Southern and other states imposed poll taxes, onerous registration requirements, and literacy tests. Registrars could ask citizens test questions at their discretion and also had the authority to pass or fail applicants with no explanation. White applicants, including those who were illiterate or who had very basic education, were not required to take these tests, or were only asked to answer one or two questions. There's also evidence of registrars giving white voters the answers. So along with threats, intimidation, beatings, and murders, these measures were successful in keeping Black voting registration percentages down to the single digits in most of the Confederate South. Federal law also kept non-whites from voting. For example, Asian American immigrants were prohibited from becoming citizens or voting until 1952, when the Immigration and Nationality Act allowed them to become citizens. Native peoples technically gained the right to vote with the passage of the Snyder Act in 1924, but well into the 1950s, Southwestern and Western states prohibited them from voting. It wasn't until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed for the registration and voting of historically suppressed minority men and women, 45 years after the 19th Amendment became law, that all women were able to vote. Let's turn to the current status of voting rights. The Voting Rights Act was substantially diluted in 2013 by the U.S. Supreme Court's 5-4 decision in Shelby County versus Holder. Shelby lifted the requirement that states with histories of racial discrimination in voting had to gain federal approval or pre-clearance before changing their election laws. In her now famous dissent, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote that, quote, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet, end quote. The subsequent increase in states passing restrictive voting laws following the decision in Shelby proved Justice Ginsburg right. For instance, after Shelby came down, Texas, which used to be subject to pre-clearance, enacted a voter identification law that a federal court had described as, quote, the most stringent in the country the previous year. And the pace of states adopting restrictive voting measures has only accelerated.